Imagine living in a city built almost entirely from wood. The year is 1666, and London is already a wounded city. Just a year earlier, the Great Plague had swept through its streets, killing nearly 100,000 people. Entire neighborhoods were marked with red crosses on their doors. But the worst disaster was still waiting. On a quiet Sunday morning, just after 1 a.m., a small fire begins inside a bakery on Pudding Lane. The baker, Thomas Farriner, had forgotten to fully extinguish his oven before going to sleep. At first, it looked harmless, just a few flames licking the wooden walls. But London was a perfect tinderbox. The summer had been incredibly dry, and the tightly packed houses were coated with pitch and tar to keep out the rain. Within minutes, the flames climbed the walls. Within an hour, the fire had jumped from house to house. And by sunrise, an unstoppable inferno had begun to consume the greatest city in England. To understand why the fire spread so quickly, you have to understand how London looked in the 1600s. This was not the wide, organized city we see today. The streets were narrow and twisting, like a maze. Many were so tight that the upper floors of buildings nearly touched across the road. These overhanging structures were called jetties, and they turned the city into a deadly tunnel of wood. Every house was built with wooden beams, straw roofs, tar-coated walls. Even worse, London's waterfront warehouses were filled with flammable goods. Barrels of oil, coal, gunpowder, and brandy sat along the Thames. When the fire reached them, it was like throwing fuel on a bonfire. Explosions rocked the city as flames shot hundreds of feet into the air. What started as a bakery accident had now become a citywide catastrophe. As the fire spread, London collapsed into chaos. People woke to the smell of smoke and the terrifying sight of entire streets burning. There was no fire brigade, no organized emergency response. The only tools people had were buckets of water and hand pumps, which were useless against flames that towered over rooftops. Panic filled the streets. Families ran through the smoke, carrying everything they owned on their backs. Some dragged furniture through the alleys. Others pushed carts filled with clothes, silver, and food. But the rich had an advantage. They could hire carts and boats to escape. The poor had to run. Soon the roads became completely jammed with desperate crowds trying to reach the River Thames, hoping to escape by boat. Boat owners quickly realized the opportunity. The price of a small rowboat skyrocketed overnight. What once cost a few pennies now cost an entire family's savings. In London, survival had suddenly become a matter of wealth and luck. By the second day, the Great Fire had become unstoppable. The wind pushed the flames across the city like a giant torch. The sky turned black with smoke so thick that people could barely see their hands. Even in the middle of the afternoon, London looked like midnight. Then came the most terrifying moment. The flames reached St. Paul's Cathedral, the largest and most important church in the city. Inside the cathedral were thousands of books and wooden scaffolds used for repairs. When the fire reached them, the entire building became a furnace. Eyewitnesses described the cathedral's lead roof melting and flowing down the streets like molten metal. It was a scene that looked less like a city fire and more like a volcanic eruption. At that moment, many people believed London was finished. With the fire raging out of control, the city finally took drastic action. The only way to stop the flames was to destroy the city itself. Soldiers and workers began blowing up entire rows of houses using gunpowder. These explosions created large, empty spaces called firebreaks. Without buildings to burn, the flames would have nowhere to spread. At first, people refused to destroy their homes. But as the inferno grew closer, they had no choice. Street after street was torn down. Buildings collapsed. Walls were blasted apart. Finally, on the fourth day, the wind began to calm. The fire slowed. Then slowly, it died. London had survived, but it had been completely transformed. When the smoke cleared, the destruction was almost unimaginable. More than 13,000 houses had burned to the ground. Nearly 80% of the city was gone. Churches, markets, homes, and entire neighborhoods had turned into ash. Tens of thousands of people were suddenly homeless. They were forced to live in temporary tent camps outside the city walls. For months, survivors struggled to rebuild their lives. But from this disaster came one of the greatest transformations in London's history. New laws were introduced. Wooden houses were banned. Buildings would now be constructed from brick and stone. The streets were widened to prevent fires from spreading again. The London that rose from the ashes was safer, stronger, and better designed. The Great Fire of 1666 nearly destroyed the city, but in the end, it also saved it, because the modern London we know today was born from that terrible night on Pudding Lane.